Can we talk? Can we start?
Yeah, let's go.
We good? All right, let's go. So, hello everyone. Thanks for attending. And tonight we are going to be talking about my friend Ben Carp's new book. Before I get into who Ben is and what he's done, I'll give you kind of the rundown. Ben holds the Daniel M. Lyons Chair in American History at Brooklyn College and is also an affiliate member of the history program of the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. The Great New York Fire of 1776 is his third book. His first book was a book called Rebels Rising, Cities in the American Revolution. Second, Defiance of the Patriots, the Boston Tea Party and the Making of America. And before I really get into to explain who Ben is, I want to give a little kind of biography of my relationship with him before I even knew him, actually kind of creep a weird way. When I was in graduate school at the University of Kansas, I was working on a dissertation on taverns, and my advisor he gave me Rebels Rising, and it really changed the way I looked at a lot of American history. And over the next 10 years, actually, I followed Ben's work. He's published articles, book chapters in the top outlets, in both scholarly outlets and more public-facing outlets. And in 2017, I knew I was going to be in New York City for a conference, so I reached out to Ben, called him, and was like, "Hey, can I, meet up with you, get a coffee or a beer?" And so we ended up, rightfully so, doing a little pub hop and having a chat. And I remember telling Ben, like, I saw Ben as the kind of academic I wanted to be. And he has only further proven to be just that since I've gotten to know him better. And I think this book he's going to be talking about tonight, we're going to be talking about together tonight, is really a perfect representation of who Ben is as an academic, as a thinker, as a scholar. I really think he's outdone himself in many ways on this. He's done some things with this book that I haven't necessarily seen before with a history book. So tonight, Ben's going to be giving a short introduction to his book, and then he and I are going to be having a Q&A, and then we are going to open up the Q&A to the audience. So you guys, as Ben talks and as we talk, think about anything you want to ask him. This is the time. So yeah, the floor is yours, Ben.
All right. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to do this without slides for now, and then if we want to show some images later, we can. But I'll start out with the basic gist. So on September 15th, the British Army captured Lower Manhattan. This leads to a panicked retreat by the American troops. It was not the best day in the history of the Continental Army, and the American cause was really not in a good place, even though this was only a couple of months after the Declaration of Independence. And then 6 days after that, in the early morning hours of September 21st, 1776, a devastating fire began. And it's a bit of a mystery why this fire happened. But one thing we know for sure is that it destroys about a fifth of the urbanized part of New York City. At the time, right, revolutionary Manhattan is at the center of a violent and uncertain civil war. It's at the center of a factious process of making a new country, a new nation. And it's at the center of the clash of two armies who didn't always behave with the highest standards of behavior, and committed some atrocities here and there. And one of my big questions is obviously it's a bit of a whodunit. Who set this fire? And when you look at the way historians have treated this subject, most historians have either thrown up their hands and said, or they essentially believed the story that the American leadership, including Washington's guys and the Patriot Press, told, which was, oh, this is a mere accident. It's not something historically significant. Everybody move on. Now, there's some evidence for it possibly having been an accident. The city, has a lot of houses and buildings made out of wood. It was tough to fight the fire because all of the church bells had been removed from town. There were few firefighters in town. There were too few civilians in town. Much of the equipment was missing or damaged. And then the wind, picks up and spreads these flaming shingles. Those of you who've seen videos of the forest fires in California or something know that windborne fire can do this kind of damage. So possibly the evidence might seem to suggest, oh yeah, it's an accident. Accidents happen, particularly during wartime, during a period of neglect and chaos. But there's also some pretty good evidence that it was on purpose, right? And in order to figure this stuff out, some of the kind of let's call them contextual questions that I wanted to ask were, well, all right, what would the strategy have been if the Americans were to do this on purpose, right? So the sort of the cui bono question, who would have benefited from the fire? I mean, Washington essentially, after the British take Staten Island and Long Island and Brooklyn, Washington essentially has three choices. He can stick around with his army and try and defend the city, in which case he's going to get overpowered by the Royal Navy and probably have his whole army captured or killed. He can leave the city, just retreat and leave the city standing for the British, or he can burn the city and thereby deprive the British of a winter headquarters, a naval base, a market for loyalists to come and hang out and sell their goods, all sorts of goodies that the British would get from having New York City. But if the Americans wanted to deprive them of it, burning the city might have been a good idea. And General Nathaniel Greene advises him of this, and Washington says he thinks this is a good idea. The other thing, though, I think you have to think about in thinking about whether this fire might have been done on purpose is the question of soldier discipline. One of the things I talk about in an early chapter is that there were rumors and threats that the soldiers of the Continental Army might set New York City on fire as early as May of 1776. They're like, if we're ever forced to retreat, we're going to burn this place to deprive the British of it. And this really ramps up after the end of August when the British Army takes Brooklyn. So Washington goes out there and he hastens to assure state legislatures, no, these rumors aren't true. I'm not going to do this. But the army of 1776 was really disobedient. They're deserting. They're creating chaos in the city. They're beating up loyalist civilians. So one of the questions I ask is, could the fire have been something, maybe the fire was something that Washington himself ordered, but maybe it was something that his own soldiers did in defiance of Washington's orders. They just kind of took matters into their own hands. And then the third thing that I think people need to know about from reading this book is something about how the British and American armies conducted themselves in wartime. The British had burned Charlestown, Massachusetts during the Battle of Bunker Hill, Falmouth in Maine, and Jamestown, Rhode Island, all during the first year of the war. The British started cannonading Norfolk, Virginia, which was the sixth largest town in the 13 colonies. And then Virginia and North Carolina militiamen went in and burned the vast majority of it. And a few months after that, Washington was ready to invade Boston, even if it meant goading the British into burning the town. But he and the British general, William Howe, had an informal truce. And so, Boston is left standing. But both sides understood that while burning towns might be ungentlemanly and had this kind of terrible effect on civilians, they also understood that both sides were willing to engage in acts of destruction. And so what do we notice in New York City? We notice combustible materials left behind by the rebels all over town. The New York City fire chief, John Baltus Dash, was so afraid of a coming fire that he buried all of his valuables in his yard for safekeeping 2 days before the fire on September 19th. On the night of the fire, witnesses said that it broke out in several places at once. British soldiers caught several people tampering with firefighting equipment, carrying incendiary materials. And in a few cases, British soldiers executed them on the spot, either by stabbing them with bayonets or throwing them into burning buildings. We have 3 different stories mentioning either 40 or 8 seamen rowing across the Hudson River from Paulus Hook, New Jersey, with a mission to burn the city. And then we have a confession from a spy an American spy in June of 1777, where he confesses not just to the acts that he was caught spying for, but also for having been one of the men who burned New York City, and he supposedly refused to name any of his accomplices. So I conclude from all of that and from other contextual evidence that the Americans did burn the city. They wanted to target a British garrison and naval base. They wanted to target wealthy loyalist property owners. They wanted to target the Church of England, what we call the Episcopal Church, right? Because Trinity Church burns down, and that was a particular target. If you've ever seen Trinity Church on the corner of Wall Street and Broadway, that's the third one. The first one is destroyed during this fire. And so again, right, it takes me back to the question of, if we think this was done on purpose, what does it say about the revolutionary movement and about the founding fathers who tried to spin this story afterwards, and the historians who spun this story afterwards on the founders' behalf? So that's all I want to say, because I want to hear what questions Dr. Scribner has for me and the rest of you. And I just want to say thank you to the Six Bridges Book Festival and the Central Arkansas Library System. I'm really pleased to be here. After teachers, libraries were my first love, and I'm just really pleased to be speaking before you. And I really look forward to any questions that you have.
We're really happy to have you here. So my first question, I have plenty of questions for you. But I want to go back a little bit for you because your real interest in fires and firefighting, from what it began, you wrote, it was in graduate school. Didn't you translate one of your first
Earlier than that, undergraduate.
undergrad? Okay, so
Yep.
it was an undergrad. Okay. So what got you, because you talked about firefighting, and I assigned this one of my classes. What got you into that? What got you interested in fires in the first place?
Yeah. I'd love to say that it was some story of like, an uncle being a volunteer fireman or something like that. Nothing like that, actually. Actually, I did have a good friend from high school who became an EMT and worked for a volunteer fire company. But no, when I was an undergrad, I was taking a junior year seminar with John Demos, and we read a very famous article on George Robert Twelves Hughes, a Boston shoemaker who becomes kind of the Forrest Gump of the revolutionary movement. He's there at the Boston Massacre. He participates in the Boston Tea Party. And at one point, Alfred Young, the author of this article, says, before the revolutionary movement really got going, Hughes was not, the shoemaker George Hughes was not particularly involved in civic life. Unlike his brother, unlike Ebenezer McIntosh, he wasn't a firefighter. And that made me wonder, well, what did it mean if you were a firefighter during the American Revolution? How do you interpret your mandate to protect property when the revolutionary movement begins? So for that junior year class, I wrote a very bad seminar paper that was about fires during the war, fire as a political symbol, firefighters participating in politics. It was all over the place. And I got a kind of charitable A- from the professor. But then I sat and thought about it between my junior and senior years. And what it became was my senior thesis on firefighters in the American Revolution, which I later turned into the article that you mentioned. But along the way, I had gotten a bee in my bonnet about this fire. Where it's like, here's New York City, what's now the biggest city in the country, and even then was the second largest town in the 13 colonies. How could it be that a substantial part of this fire had burned down, and yet so many historians are looking at this and kind of saying, yeah, we're really not sure what happened. It seemed to me impossible that 1776, with the revolution being so closely studied, that no one would have an answer to this question. And so I really never let it go. I mean, I did published an article on this in 2006, but other projects kept getting in the way. I wasn't able to write about this as fully as I wanted to. This is finally my opportunity to kind of treat the subject with the full length treatment that it deserves. And what I would do is every time I would go into an archive, I'd be like, oh, this person was like hanging around the Northeast in 1776. Let's see what they say. Let's see what they wrote back home to their wives. Let's see what was in the newspapers then. Let's see what's in the ship logs from around then, and from British warships. Let's see what British Army officers, Hessian officers had to say. So I would just look everywhere, because what I was interested in was what happened in this 8 to 12 hour ordeal on one day in American history. Yeah.
Well, and I just made a connection actually, that first article about firefighters came out in November 2001.
October, yeah, right
after
October,
October 2001, a month after 9/11.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it was incredibly timely. It's almost eerie.
We inserted something at the very last minute, right? Kind of thanking the rescue workers, because it seemed like it resonated, right? Firefighters were America's heroes at that time. What's really interesting in terms of a 9/11 connection is that the Great Fire of 1776, I mean, the World Trade Center is built on landfill. So that area did not exist as part of New York City back then. However, it's really the same part of town. And if you visit St. Paul's Cathedral today, which is really only one of 3 18th century structures that still survives on Manhattan Island, or not 18th century, but pre-revolutionary structures. But if you go and visit St. Paul's Cathedral, that was a place of refuge for 9/11 rescue workers. And it was also a notable survivor of the fire of 1776. So at these moments of chaos, the idea of this religious building being a place of sanctuary both times really kind of resonated for me.
Yeah, it's you mentioned that at one point in your book, and I think that's a really powerful moment, and it's very it's very deep. So was there a moment that you decided this is going to be my next book? Like what made it you decide, like, all right, it's, I've been kind of not dancing around it, because you wrote an excellent article in Early American Studies about the fire that really changed the conversation, actually. What made you decide this needs book length treatment.
Yeah, this is sort of embarrassing, right? Because it speaks to like books that I didn't write and decided to write this one instead, right? So for a while, I was thinking I would write an entire book on the destruction of towns, cities, and Indian settlements during the Revolutionary War. And I even started a FileMaker database to start compiling stuff and things like that. And I knew that whatever I put together would be useful data. But in thinking about it, I was realizing, like, in terms of what I could say intellectually, the juice wasn't going to be worth the squeeze. That for all the research and painstaking, like where exactly geographically did this take place, how many buildings were burned, who was responsible for all of that painstaking work, you know, what the payoff was going to be, I was thinking wasn't going to be as large. So sometimes I think that you can say something even bigger with a micro history, right? With a smaller study, that by focusing on one particular incident, I'd be able to branch out and say more interesting things than if I tried to cover a lot of things without really being able to adequately capture. Because the truth is, like, the burning of Indian settlements, it's a whole other set of issues. That's very hard to look at alongside, like, let's say the burning of Fairfield and Norwalk in Connecticut, or you know, or the burning of Georgetown, South Carolina. It's just, I had a way of doing it. I laid out an outline for the book. You know, but I just decided, you know what, I want to tell this story, right? This old story that I've been interested in, and I want to tell that story again.
Yeah,
and there's been interesting work done that helped me with this. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna, you know, and that's something I really like about this book is it's really recentering New York City in so much of not just what happened in the American Revolution, but our memory around the American Revolution, and that's what a lot of this book is. Not just about, quote, what happened or trying to get to what happened, but it's a lot about our memory of this event. There's so much divisiveness in America right now about our historical memory and the way we should construct that memory and engage with that memory. What was it like for you, kind of kicking over some stones and maybe presenting people? And I'm going to have further questions with this, but just going in this book, what was it like for you engaging with this memory of the American Revolution?
Yeah, there's so much I want to say in response to that, because for one thing, I'm surprised that you say that there's a lot on memory, because I had like a 12 to 14,000 word essay on historiography and I just dumped it. Like, I salted a little bit of it into footnotes here and there, but like, you know, I mean, maybe you've read some of the online pieces I've published, which sort of rescued some of that stuff, but I really didn't talk. I tried not to talk that much in the book about memory, because I worry that a lot of revolutionary historians fall into what I call the memory trap. Now, there are great studies by Al Young, who I mentioned before, and Sarah Pearsall and all the others on memory and the American Revolution. But I worry sometimes that some people end up writing about the memory of the thing rather than the thing itself. And I really wanted the book to be about the thing itself mostly.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, right, like, I do have this kind of strong feeling that it's historians' later distortion of the fire and contemporaries' distortion of the fire that led us to misunderstand this event. And so that's really something that I thought was important. Now, what it says for kicking over rocks in our contemporary moment, I mean, the late Jan Lewis of Rutgers, right? Some used to call, like, the way we sometimes understand the revolution and how we're taught it in school as the bedtime story of the revolution, right? About the noble founding fathers in their knee breeches, you know, and about the heroic soldiers suffering in the snow. And those stories are not inaccurate. There are many things to admire about people in both those groups. But to me, I think it's really important to understand the revolution from a much wider array of perspectives too. You know, women are half the population. What do they think? What do the enslaved think? What do free Black people think? What do the Native Americans think? What do white loyalists think? What do Hessian soldiers think? What do British soldiers think? What's going on in places like India or the Mediterranean at the same time? What's going on in the Gulf Coast? Right? There's so much in the Mississippi River Valley, right? You know, so all of those different perspectives, you know, like, as I say these things, you know, the historians who have worked on those subjects. Yes. But what we get in the sum total of that is a way of understanding the revolution that is not just a bedtime story, but that speaks to complexities and divided perspectives in a way that is relevant to us today, yes. Right? That, like, we're not going to have a neat unitary country ever, probably, right? But we have had ways of coming together of building good institutions to work out our differences. The revolution might or might not be a good example of that, because on the one hand, they do go to war, but on the other hand, they also build a new country out of that. And there's so much more to that story than I think we typically learn in school.
Yeah, I guess I'm saying that you're forcing people to confront our popular historical memory of the American Revolution, because this is something and I really appreciate that you do this, is that the rebels don't always come out looking great in this book, which it's just how it should be. You have this great quote on page 5: the rebels were at their most admirable when they stood tall and signed their names beneath the lofty principles of liberty, equality, and unity. They're at their worst when they skulked and deceived, burned and massacred, unleashed campaigns of terror, and denigrated people as less worthy of citizenship. And I really like your treatment of the New Englanders in this. They kind of had this "you think you're better than me" attitude, and people kind of like, who are these guys? You know, they'd always been kind of the rabble rousers. What kind of engagement, what kind of sense did you get from them? Speak on that a little bit more, about who the New Englanders were during the American Revolution and how other people felt about them.
This is so appropriate for my first talk with a Southern audience, to just come down here and start ragging on Yankees, right? I'm here for it, really. I was educated at the University of Virginia, right? You know, although that's the North to people from the South. So,
yeah.
And the South to people from the North. But anyway, so what I would say, I mean, the New Englanders are interesting because, I mean, the young boys from New England like knew that like so many adult men were going to go off to, you know, fight a war against the French, or, you know, go out to sea and possibly die there. They're raised on brawling with one another in the streets. But they also have this kind of communitarian ethos that comes from the church and the town meeting that really led to not an egalitarian society, but a somewhat relatively more like kind of egalitarian ethos than you would find in you know, some of the more aristocratic cultures of the middle colonies and the South. So the Yankees are obnoxious in a certain way. They do have a chip on their shoulder. They have nightmares about the Church of England sending over a bishop and preventing them from practicing religion the way they wanted to. You know, and they're sharp-elbowed traders, and they can't really get a lot of crops out of the ground, so they go off and fish, or they build ships, or they, you know, smuggle molasses, and that's how they make their livelihood. So the New Englanders are sort of a breed apart, and they are not the only ones at the forefront of the revolutionary movement, but we often give them credit for having been at the forefront of the revolutionary movement. And certainly the folks in Parliament saw them that way, because so much of the bad news was coming from Boston. And maybe the Bostonians get a little bit too much credit as a result, but clearly they were on Parliament's radar. And after the Boston Tea Party, which is subject to my last book, right, like that's who the British zero in on for punishment is Massachusetts. And of course, the war starts in Massachusetts for months, right? That what passes for the Continental Army is around Boston. Yes, they bring in some Marylanders, some Virginians, some Pennsylvanians to join that army, but it's still majority New Englanders in 1776. And it's all very well and good when they're defending their home turf in 1775 and early 76. When they move into New York, all of a sudden there's a culture clash between the New York troops and the New England troops. And I think that had something to do with why the fire came out the way it did.
Yeah. Well, and even building off that, to go even more specific, recently historians have been painting a more complex picture of George Washington. You know, and we're definitely getting that here. And I really like your treatment of George Washington. How did this book force you to kind of grapple with some of the maybe the less celebrated sides of this general, or some of the gray areas?
You can catch Washington saying some pretty ugly stuff. Like he hears about this, I mean, you know, the burning of Indian towns, right? Especially during the Sullivan-Clinton expedition of 1779 is a big example. You know, so clearly Washington was willing to send men with torches to do dirty deeds. You know, you could argue, oh, okay, there's one set of rules for Native Americans and another set of rules for white settlements. But at the same time, right, like you can see him kind of saying like, all right, let's weigh the destruction of private property in one town versus the common cause, right, of America, and making those kinds of calculations. So look, some of the most well-known pieces of evidence that historians began talking about in the 1780s was Washington writing to Congress for permission to burn the city, and Congress ostensibly saying no, and Washington kind of saying okay. And that gets publicized over and over in early histories of the revolution, saying, look at Washington. One of the things we admire most about not Washington is that he wasn't like Cromwell or Napoleon or Julius Caesar. He deferred to civilian authority. He didn't seize power, even though he had the opportunity to. Look at this great example of that. Well, some of the early histories of the revolution will mention that correspondence and then not mention that a fire happened, 3 weeks later. So it's like, wait, you left out the part of the story where then a fire happened anyway. What's going on there? And then a letter that, as far as I know, wasn't well known to historians until the 1940s is when he writes to his cousin Lund in October of 1776, after the fire was over, and he says, man, Congress not letting me burn the city was a huge mistake. This is going to go down as one of the capital errors of Congress. And then he's talking about something else. And then a paragraph later, he's like, oh yeah, by the way, Providence, by which he means God or some good honest fellow, has done what we didn't see fit to do for ourselves because a quarter of the city is burned. And then he says, however, enough of it remains to answer the British purposes. So his only regret is that more of the city wasn't destroyed.
Yeah.
And then you find him vouching for various captains, Continental Army captains who were accused of having participated in the fire, right? And he's like, oh, let's get this guy a job. Ooh, let's get this guy out of prison. Ooh, let's get this guy's widow some money under the table for the services that he was engaged in. So there seems to be a disconnect. And Washington's family, his staff officers, are out there like an offensive line immediately after the fire saying, we were 7 miles away. We had nothing to do with this. And look at what the Hessians and British were doing. Look at, and just trying to kind of use distraction like a stage magician and get everybody paying attention to somebody else. So Washington is a kind of mysterious figure in a way at the center of my book. I don't think I necessarily have him dead to rights. I'm not comfortable saying Washington definitely did this, but I do want to lay out the evidence and see what the readers think.
Yeah. Well, and this just occurred to me, actually. New York City remains fundamental or really formative in Washington's mind throughout the Revolution. He tries to capture Prince William Henry when he's stationed in New York City in 1781. The first thing Washington does, an announcement of the Treaty of Paris, comes into New York City and starts trying to re-enslave all these freed Black peoples there. So I think that you rightly start this conversation about Washington. New York City is really kind of living rent-free in his head.
It's like Captain Ahab in The White Whale. He really wants to take New York City back. Even on the eve of Yorktown, he's like, wait, can't we cross the Hudson River and take New York City? And they're like, well, no, we've got this opportunity to link up with the French army and maybe capture and trap Cornwallis at Virginia. Let's do that. And he's like, no, right. Yeah. And so the last moment of the war in our heads is Washington finally triumphantly marching into New York City in November 25th, 1783. And then, of course, later taking his first oath of office in New York City as well, because it's briefly the federal capital. So yes, Washington's relationship with New York City throughout his life is an important one. But yeah, 1776 is really his first opportunity to kind of confront what to do about this place. We forget that some historians talk about the British occupation of New York because it lasts for a long time, from September 1776 until November 1783. But from about April until September, Washington is there, and it's an American occupied city, and the American troops do not always behave themselves all that well under his direction. And there's examples of violence against loyalists, and then the loyalist civilian will go to Washington and be like, hey, can you do something about these guys? He's like, oh, those guys are militiamen, they're not in my army, and kind of looking the other way, and even encouraging getting people to shut the loyalists up because he thought they were kind of fifth column and spying on his own army, which they probably were, but he probably was also taking up some innocent civilians during the process.
I love that you mentioned that too, because it was a British city. It was, we call it British occupied city. It's like, well, no, it's their city technically. If we look at the American Revolution as a civil war where they occupy it, and they lay waste to the place basically before the British re-inhabit it. They dig all these trenches, and the people who come back in. So they make things even worse for these British people when they eventually come back in. Now, speaking of New York City, this is also, of course, a very personal book for you because you live in New York City and work in New York City. How has researching and writing this book over the past, X amount of years, how has it changed your experience living in the city? Do you look for different things now? Do you think about the city differently at all? Because I know not a lot remains. The city's a very different looking place now.
It's a good question, right? Because, like I live in a part of the city where the grid doesn't quite fit, because I'm in Washington Heights, and where there's all this topography that's sort of jutting out of the ground, and like nature kind of reasserting itself, right? As opposed to the grid at right angles that on the basis of the 1811 plan, they used to cover most of Manhattan above the lower original part. And what I say in the book, right, at the very beginning, is that New Yorkers have a propensity for kind of tearing things down and forgetting, paving over, not really remembering their past. I mean, if you visit Boston and Philadelphia, you have a sense of their revolutionary past and the way that they engage with it. In New York City, you have to really squint to see it because of the tall buildings, because so much of the topography and rivers have been covered over, and because probably a lot of patriotic Americans don't think there's much to celebrate about New York's role in the revolution, because it was occupied by the British Army, and and so many New York civilians then were forced to collaborate with the British Army. So to me, it's a matter of, well, okay, given how invisible the 18th century landscape is in this city, what can historians do in order to recapture that? What kinds of things can public historians, archaeologists, poets, other kinds of scholars and thinkers and creative artists, what can they do in order to recapture the past? I mean, look, the Hamilton musical is maybe an example of that, right? Of like, Broadway, right? A much more modern, scene from New York, trying to kind of recapture this 18th century past and celebrating New York, as so many Broadway musicals do, and things like that. So, New York, I think, it is the center of the war in 1776. It is living rent-free, as you said, in Washington's head throughout the war. It deserves to play a role in our understanding of this story of American origins. And as I walk the streets, I don't know, I'm teaching a history of New York City class for the first time, actually, this semester. And taking it all the way up to the 20th and 21st century, which is definitely not my comfort zone. And actually, my predecessor, I think, just stopped in 1898. For us, we're getting to 1898 next week, and then the rest of the semester are going to be like white knuckling it, being like, all right, I got to talk about subways and skyscrapers, I guess. But so I think I'll be reflecting on this more as I continue to teach this class. So I don't have a great answer for you, but I guess I gave some of the answer that's in the book.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. I like to show my students the New World Trade Center. When you ride up the elevator, they show but I think about this a lot, is you can't really find, 18th century New York City looks so different than now. It would have been considered a very rural, green space, like more like Washington Heights. So you kind of have that connection. Now, zooming in even more, I mentioned this to you. I love your great fire map on page 105.
I can show everyone this. Let me screen share. I pulled this up. This map. Can everyone see?
Yeah. So yes. So what Dr. Carp has done here is he's taken his research, is all of these diverse accounts, and this is a great example of digital humanities. I oftentimes have a hard time actually defining what digital humanities is, but if I had to someone, I think this would be a great example, where he's shown ignition points, incendiaries, witnesses, the actual burned area. And I think this is, well, just what is this? What are you trying to do with this map, Ben?
Yeah, so most of the maps will show this burned area. And by representing it as a kind of contiguous destruction zone, I really think that reinforces the idea that it might have been an accidental fire, that it was just, that it just the wind blows it in a certain direction, and that wind-blown fire just kind of carves this path through New York City, and that's all we need to know. But if you look at some of the incendiary materials that were discovered closer to the East River, in the parts of the city that actually have the most military and commercial value, you start to wonder whether the only reason those places didn't burn was just kind of bad luck, and the way the wind was blowing, to kind of show, like, one of the things I want to try and show with this is that, like, the rebels really may have been trying to destroy the city from points all over the city. And then the other thing is, I just refer to all these geographic locales in the text, and I want people to be able to have a point of reference. But I'm hoping that that this map will suggest at least a little that there might have been more going on even in the parts of the city that were not, that were not successfully burned.
Yeah. I hadn't noticed. I love that you include Vauxhall Hospital up there, which was once a pleasure garden, which some, but I mean, you see this. New York City was small by our modern day standards. How many people lived in New York City in 1776 before the war broke out?
Yeah, before people start evacuating to
Yeah.
avoid armies marching through their streets, it's about 25,000.
Yeah.
Is the most reasonable estimate, which is enough to make it the second largest in the 13 colonies. Philadelphia is
Exactly.
40,000, and that's it. I mean, you compare it to like Mexico City in those days, right?
Yeah.
Like American cities, British American cities are so tiny. But yeah, I mean, because it was only this lower part of Manhattan and the rest of it was largely rural, you still had that feel of density, and on some occasions probably even anonymity to a certain degree.
Yes.
Although you think about 25,000 people, that's less than a lot of colleges these days.
Exactly. Yeah. And then this gives me a good chance to kind of transition, and how impressed, and I've told you this as well, is how impressed I am by your research in this piece. I was telling my wife that it feels like you went in and talked to all these people. You got anyone who saw it or heard about it or witnessed it, their voices are in here. And it gives us this incredibly diverse view of what it was like to live in New York City at the time. And it almost feels like you were there, like walking around with a little detective's pad, taking notes and talking to people. But it gets into this issue of memory, like what eyewitnesses, what's going on here. So how did you organize your notes and your thoughts to come together with this incredibly succinct, clear depiction of this very muddled event?
Oh, thanks. Well, I mean, I love the Scrivener software. That's crucial for organizing notes, in my opinion. Yeah, I mean, well, the first source, a source that I first looked at when I was an undergraduate, I was on Central Park West at the New York Historical Society. It's this set of like 40 depositions that were given to the British Army in 1783. And that's its own mystery, is like, why were the British bothering to investigate it in 1783 as they were leaving? But they do. And these depositions survived, not actually in British government archives. They were kept in the clerk's personal papers. And he was a loyalist who moved to New Brunswick. And then the head of the New Brunswick Historical Society in 1893 donated these papers to the New York Historical Society, and that's why they're there in this privately held collection. So that was one of the first places where you started to see witnesses. But many historians would say, hey, how reliable is memory after 7 years? Maybe that's not trustworthy by itself. And so I set out to just corroborate as best as I could. Newspaper accounts are maybe untrustworthy for another reason, but were there any contemporaries on the ground, British soldiers, British sailors, loyalists who were wandering around, Hessian soldiers, Americans who saw the fire from across the river or further up Manhattan, or actually the fire was visible from New Haven, Connecticut. Because there's no electric light, and so like that becomes this big beacon of light, from what is that, 90 miles or 80 miles away or something like that.
That's
and just the idea that the night sky would have been so dark that you could see a fire at that distance. So yeah, I mean, so a lot of it was the fire itself, just like I had this massive thing of all these different accounts and trying to pick and choose. All right, who's talking about this most vividly? Am I representing all the different perspectives? Am I coming at it from people who thought it was an accident versus people who didn't think it was an accident? I mean, there's a lot to what you're asking, and I'm not entirely sure what else to say about it, but it was turning a lot of pages. The truth is, I feel actually a little bit modest about this, which in that I don't think I've seen everything. I wasn't able to get to some archives because of the pandemic, but a couple. But what I'm really hoping is that the book will send up sort of a bat signal, so that other people who are looking at records in 1776, if they've read my book, they'll maybe be on the lookout for more accounts, more perspectives on the fire, and that they'll write me and kind of say, hey, I found this from a Connecticut soldier. This seems suggestive to me, and I can fit it in with the other pieces that I've already put together, and maybe it'll make my story even more solid than it is now, because this is the first full-length treatment of the fire. Before this, it was only a chapter at best in books that were usually about something else.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you can be modest, but you've done incredible work here, and I definitely think that will happen. I mean, you've made me rethink. As you know, I'm when I'm reading through British and German accounts now, I'm always like, oh, what are they saying about the fire? And you've always found everything. I'm always trying to shoot you, but it's definitely changed the way I look at this as well, and I guarantee that it will do the same for others. Do you have one more research question for you here? Because I love this kind of research nerd stuff. But did you have any like other big like aha moments or those, kind of those moments when you're doing research and you find something that really shocks you or, that kind of stands out in your mind other than going to the New York Historical Society and finding that collection?
Yeah, the most shocking moment for me, and it requires a little background to tell, was this letter from Colonel Henry Jackson in Boston to Colonel Henry Knox, who later becomes the first Secretary of War, who's Washington's chief artillery officer during the war. And Jackson is in Boston, and he writes to Knox, "Hey," and this is after the fire. He says, "Hey, the newspaper items that you sent me, the letters that you sent me to put into the newspaper, I've done it, and they've done the trick, and everybody's believing it." And then you go and look at those newspaper items, and they are the most propagandized pro-American version of what had happened during the fire. Like Hessians plundering, British soldiers slitting people's throats, all this stuff that, and no suggestion that the Americans might have had anything to do with the fire. And so the idea that Washington's inner circle was inserting news items into New England newspapers in order to convince the American public, because these stories are then reprinted in a bunch of Connecticut and Rhode Island newspapers as well. That was when I was like, whoa, I can't necessarily prove that Washington had anything to do with the fire, but I sure as heck can prove that Washington's guys were definitely trying to shape the story of the fire after it happened.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because this is a book. A lot of this book is about this propaganda machine that's running during the revolution, where both sides and everyone in between are trying to shift their public opinion their way. So what do you think this tells us about the revolution in general? How effective do you think they were beyond just the Great Fire, especially this rebel propaganda machine via newspapers, letters, public opinion, taverns, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, and if we don't want to talk about it in terms of propaganda, because that reminds us of the Nazis during World War II or something, we can just say public opinion, right?
Public opinion.
The leading revolutionaries were masters at shaping public opinion. You think of any one of them, Samuel Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, all of them were absolute masters at shaping public opinion. I mean, Franklin will publish a fake issue of a newspaper just to make the British look bad. And Washington, right, if you just look at the volume, and this is all freely available online, if you look at the volume of Washington's correspondence, he's spending most of the war at his desk or with his clerks at their desks, writing to people in order to shore up alliances, in order to, it's a civil war. People's allegiances could have gone either way. And it's very important for the American rebel leaders to make sure that they have followers going along with them and staying on their side, because there is a lot of temptation to go back to the British, and you don't want Americans to give into that temptation. You want them to continue to support the rebellion if you believe that independence is the way forward. And so showing that, I think, is really important, because without shaping public opinion, it's harder to see how the Americans could get the supplies they needed, the troops they needed, right? All of that is reliant on people believing that the cause will be successful and that the Americans are fighting in a just way.
Yeah.
And for the right reasons.
Yeah, reading the newspapers for the time, especially rebel-controlled newspapers, they can be really funny. They're very witty. It gives us this real connection to people in the past. Now, before we open up for the last 15 minutes here to audience questions, I have to ask, what's next? What do you think your next book project is?
No, I just want to lie fallow for a little while. I need a break. No, honestly, part of me really does want to kind of just take it a little easy, work on mentoring the graduate students that I'm mentoring, and and some younger scholars. That's really what's been giving me a lot of joy lately. I did get interested in in some of the folks from Eastern Connecticut who I think helped to burn the city, and I think that's an area of the 13 colonies that is poorly understood. I'm also interested in thinking about the concept of loyalism in different ways. I might propose some stuff, to talk about that. I don't know. So I've got some stuff kicking around. They probably won't keep me out of the archives for too long, but I'm not in a huge hurry. I'm not so yeah, I'm right now, everything's at the gleam in my eye stage. Perfect. I haven't really geared up to do the next thing just yet.
You should enjoy this. You've really produced something great here, and you always have other things on. I mean, you wrote that incredible cosmopolitanism article in William and Mary Quarterly because you'll come out with something.
There's something arising out of that too. One of the guys in that, I'm tempted to write a biography of him,
See,
even though it would be a biography of a minor figure. That's my other idea, big idea,
here.
but nobody seems to like that idea.
All right. So we have. Does anyone here? We can ask. Does anyone want to ask like a voice or a video question? Is that well? Actually, I guess they can't do that. So we have a webinar chat here. Let me just pick one out. So Emma Callahan asked, is Washington's the reason that were Washington's opinions of New York, why it's still to this day plays such a large role in our country? So is that kind of like, is Washington's vision of New York still, does that help it?
That's hard. I mean, you think of Washington as a guy who really just like always wanted to like retire underneath his vine and fig tree, that like what he wanted to celebrate was, the pastoral life. And of course, he's a land speculator. So he's also interested in like distant Western lands over the mountains too. So he has other geographic focuses in mind, not just New York City. I think New York City's prominence nowadays just, that's all owed to its geography and its, standing astride commerce for so long, right? Just being able to have access to New Jersey, the Hudson River Valley, and then through the Erie Canal to the entire Midwest. I mean, that is what, and then building the financial apparatus around and banking apparatus around that is really what gives New York City its prominence nowadays. And that those transportation connections lead to commercial connections, which is why we have advertising and publishing emanating out of there. I mean, so, it's not, yes, New York enjoys its brief moment in the sun as a federal capital, but most of the leading Americans were like, we don't want our federal capital to be someplace urban. Then the merchants will like have too much say. Let's put it somewhere that's like, basically the middle of nowhere. Let's pick a bend of the Potomac and build our nation's capital there. And, and that was great for Washington because it was like right in his backyard. So yeah, I think Washington and New York, eventually parted ways and they were kind of okay with that. And that there's a tension, I think, between Washington's Republican rural vision to some degree and the urban cosmopolitanism that New York City represents. But that's a long story and maybe a topic for another day.
Yeah, instead they decided to build our capital in a swamp, which but this is a great question from Jackson Brown. Did you draw any interest in this topic from the Great Fire of London, or the kind of analogs there?
That is a great question. And I've read a little bit about the Fire of London, but one of the things I promised myself I would do, and now I realize I didn't, would be to like just read a bunch of narrative accounts of the Great Fire that maybe would have given me a good example and maybe given me some ideas of good questions to ask about the 1776 fire. And I'm realizing now that I didn't do that. And so while I do feel like I have a pretty decent knowledge of like fires in early modern Europe, and I tried to read widely on that subject and on military destruction in Europe during the early modern period as well. And I've read some good fiction stuff on the Great Fire of London in 1666 as well. But I can't say that it ended up having a direct influence on me. I think I discovered this fire first before I ever read anything about 1666.
I will tell you that someone I follow on Twitter just shared a journal entry from someone who witnessed they could see the Great Fire of London from Oxford as it was burning. So it's very, getting back to what you were saying with New Haven. We have Robert Wong, who asked, although Washington was celebrated as a liberator of New York City after the British evacuation, was there resentment by some New Yorkers felt that he burned New York City, or they thought he burned it, or?
Not that I found. The answer to that is not that I found, in part because I think the suggestion that Washington burned New York was unsayable. Like, no one was going to be out there saying that. I mean, I think that there were probably Americans in their secret hearts who thought as Washington did, which was that, hey, burning New York City was good for us because it deprived the British of housing stock, over the winter, and could have deprived the British of even more. That wasn't something that Americans could say out loud, but it was something that they were willing to kind of celebrate in their secret hearts. And some New Yorkers were patriotic enough to be like, hey, we sacrificed this city in the name of the greater cause, and that might have made some very patriotic New Yorkers feel good. Were there other New Yorkers who despised Washington for this? either because maybe they were loyal to the British or they just wanted to be left alone. I'm sure there were. But again, right, because Washington and his followers had worked so hard to kind of make sure that the story was not one of Washington having done this, instead they probably just chalked it up to circumstances, right? It just became one of those things that you couldn't really say out loud. And I've never really seen a lot of contemporaries being like, oh yeah, when Washington burned this place. British and loyalists, maybe, but people who then, wanted to be in the good graces of the United States, he didn't say anything against Washington. He was the victor of the American Revolution.
Yes.
And he's celebrated in only more so after he's died, all the way into the 20th century, right? Trying to pulling Washington down off his pedestal is really not something you did, right? Like, who's that guy who invents the term debunking? I think that's in the 1930s, and even then, it was a sort of disreputable pastime to debunk the founding fathers.
Well, and didn't many British people still kind of celebrated him and respected him for what he'd done? I know I've read some accounts of when British people come over to America after the Revolution. They want to go see George Washington. Some of them want to go meet him. So I think you really get to.
Troy Bickham is great on this during the war, that like lots of British people actually admired him. And yeah, by the time you get into the late 19th century, British historians on both the left and the right were like, Washington was so admirable, and there's no way he burned New York City.
Yep.
The conservatives love him because they kind of see him as being a little bit aristocratic, and the liberals love him because they see him as like a kind of Republican liberator of his country.
Yes.
So it's interesting, right? Like no matter where you are on the spectrum in British politics, by the time you get into well into the 19th century, they admire Washington as much as the Americans do.
Hannah asks, are there any lingering questions surrounding the fire that have yet to be answered, other than, I mean, anything that you especially think that kind of gets you? Or
I mean, there are some questions that will just never be answered because the Howe brothers' papers were destroyed in a fire in Ireland in 1826. Carleton's General Guy Carleton, the British commander who ordered the investigation in 1783, his papers don't survive. The prison records from 1776 were lost at sea off the coast of Georgia or on the way to Georgia. There's tons of records that just do not survive, where some of my additional questions could have been answered. I mean, there is still a mystery at the heart of the book, which is who burned New York City, and and what were they thinking? That's a question that we might never fully know. And then the secondary mystery to me is why did the British bother to investigate it in 1783, and then why did they let it go? And I have some good assumptions about that, but I don't have direct evidence to answer either of those questions.
That is so interesting that they'd come back with this investigation in 1783, that long after the event, when you'd think they had, quote, bigger fish to fry.
Yeah. And they do, and that's why they eventually give it up. But I think what Carleton wanted is he wanted to kind of balance the moral scales, because there were all these Americans out there saying, we're going to punish loyalists, we're going to seize all their property because look at all the things the British destroyed during the war. And I think Carleton wanted to be like, but on the other hand, you guys burned this city. And so he wanted to like compile some evidence saying that was the case, but then he was too busy evacuating, and so they gave it up.
Shanique wrote, were there any other benefits or consequences from the burn besides the fire department, which they actually had before that? And I think how are fire departments similar or different than the ones today? Because New York City now, of course, we think, especially since 9/11, with like these New York City fire departments. So do you see much a thread from the 18th century firefighting culture up to today?
Well, I think that ethos of kind of protecting property and potentially risking one's life, and certainly like exerting yourself in this kind of manly way on behalf of your community, I think that's something that survives from the 18th century to the present. But of course, in the 18th century and early 19th century, they're reliant on volunteer companies. Now that's not unfamiliar to a lot of Americans, because a lot of Americans live in smaller communities that still rely on volunteer fire companies. Nowadays, right, New York City and most large cities have to use paid firefighting services. But well into the 19th century, famously, right, New York City is still using these volunteer companies in order to fight the fire. Now, what you need is, I mean, every citizen was supposed to turn out in the event of a fire because you needed everybody to pass buckets back and forth from a water source to an engine. but you also needed guys who were experts at working the engine, because it was mechanically somewhat sophisticated. If it broke down, you needed people who knew what they were doing, and so that that required a certain level of expertise, and that was what raised firefighters a little bit up above the common citizen.
Yeah, speaking of that, you found some incredible material culture stuff for this book. I love that you found that fire bucket that the handles had been cut, and you found the I wasn't familiar with this, the musket balls that had been altered to be even more, horrible.
Yeah.
And I thought that was this really poignant moment, this idea of people during the fire, incendiaries going in and cutting the leather handles off of buckets, trying to hide ladders. Yeah, I really like those. Finally, and then we'll wrap it up after this question. What is something that you would have liked to cover in your book that you didn't or couldn't? You mentioned that you cut the historiography of the movie out.
My answer to this is actually based on audience questions like this. I keep getting asked, what happened to the burned part of New York City? Did the British ever repair it? When did New Yorkers get around to repairing it? And I didn't spend a lot of time on that in the book, a little bit. But what I wish I had done is maybe gone into the Manhattan Common Council records for the immediate years after the war and talked a little bit about how that part of New York City was reconstructed. I think people are interested in that part of the story, and it's not something I spent a lot of time doing. I can tell you that that the nickname for that area of New York City is Canvas Town, because it was like burned out husks of buildings with like ships sails, canvas sails being used as temporary roofs. And there's some very sad and ugly stories about how that became a kind of slum and a place for the down and out during the war. But I didn't, I maybe could have done more to tell that aftermath part of the story, and I didn't. Maybe it's something I could still do just as an article to kind of supplement what I had done, see if that tells us anything about the origins of New York City after the Revolutionary War. And I kind of know where I would look for that sort of thing. But it might be a nice little coda to the story, because it is something I keep getting asked about. People are interested in Phoenix-like renewal, right? We live in an age of disasters, right? And we're interested in what it takes to recover from those disasters. Maybe that's a story I should have reflected a little bit better in the book.
I think you could definitely, yeah. A guy named Isaac Weld visited America. I was just reading his diary the other day in 1785, and he mentioned visiting New York City, Britain, and he talked about the city was beautiful, but there were this burned out section, so it was still, yeah. So you could easily do that. Well, thank you so much for your time and all the great questions that people asked. I think we had a great Q&A session here. Everyone, Dr. Carp's book is available for sale at all of your reputable and popular booksellers. Do you have anywhere that you would direct them to specifically for that?
Oh no! I mean, obviously, if you can find an independent bookstore, in Arkansas, please patronize them. Failing that, the Fort Plain bookstore, was offering a discount pretty early on. They're in upstate New York, or really, yeah, however you prefer to buy your books. I'm here for it, and there will be an audiobook edition, but I don't know when. And it might be a while, so maybe don't wait for that if you're feeling impatient. And thank you to everybody for your questions, and thank you, Vaughn.
Yes, thank you. And we have Wordsworth Books in Little Rock. They're an independent book. No, they will order Dr. Carp's book for you, and so support your local bookstores. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed this, and yeah, happy hunting for your next project and everything you do from here. And enjoy this.
Thanks, everyone. This was great.